Hello, hi Loda.
Hi Nina, how are you?
I'm well. I'm so glad to be with you today.
It's an honor and a privilege to have you at our conference on co-creation. So thank you for your time. I assume that most people know you very well and know your work, but for the attendants that do not know you, could you very briefly introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I am actually very sorry that I am not there with you in Leuven. I'm here in Santa Cruz, California, in the US. And I've spent the last 20 years working in museums really as an advocate for more participatory and co-creative approaches to how culture and art and history and science get shared in our communities. So I've been a museum exhibit designer, I've been a museum director, and then more recently was the founder of a global project called Of, By, For All, where we work with museums, libraries, parks, and theaters around the world that are all striving to become of their communities, co-created by their communities, and more welcoming for the diversity of their communities. And so today I'm a board member of By For All and a continued advocate for museums being deeply involved and embedded with the communities that they serve.
What does it mean for you personally, co-creation, and what does it mean for museums today? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, to me, co-creation means something very specific. It was now 11 years ago that my first book, The Participatory Museum, was published. And in that book, sort of presented this structure and this taxonomy of different forms of participation in museums, from people contributing to them, collaborating with them, co-creating with them, and then for museums hosting communities to do their own thing. And I would say that all four of these are versions of active participation, which is not just about being engaged or interacting in a museum, but is fundamentally about the idea that the museum is changed based on what is brought in by the co-creators or the participants. And I actually see co-creation as the highest standard version of what it means for people to participate in a museum, because it's in a situation where the museum is not dictating the terms, that in a co-creation, there is true partnership and reciprocity and respect between the institution and the community or communities with whom the institution is co-creating. So I think there are some forms of participation where a museum might dictate the terms, might say, please contribute your art or contribute your story. Or even where the museum might say, we want to collaborate with you on this exhibition or on this project. But when it comes to a co-creative project, I see that as one where the museum and the community are coming together to negotiate what are we trying to create together? How does it draw on the resources of the institution as well as the resources of the community? And often the result or the outcome is something that neither the museum nor the community group could have envisioned or could have created on their own.
So, and given those four different types of participatory engagement that are possible, do you also consider them linear, or could you mix elements of those four forms of participatory engagement?
They're not linear in terms of one being better or more evolved than another, but they are linear in terms of the extent to which the museum is relinquishing authority or control or power to the community. And so, for example, if a museum is inviting contribution, the museum might say, okay, we want your stories, but they must be 50 words and we need them by a certain date. And the museum is reserving quite a lot of power in how that project will happen. There's still some trust involved because you don't know what people will do with their 50 words, but the museum is designing and prescribing the environment in which those 50 words come in. And the further down the line you go to collaboration or co-creation or to the museum hosting a community doing their own thing, the more you are giving over power, the more you are saying we trust and believe that in partnership we'll figure this out, or the more you're trusting the community to take the lead and take the power themselves. When I was a museum director at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, we certainly did projects across all four of those types of participation. And frankly, co-creative projects in particular take a lot more time and resources because there's a lot more relationship building that happens than with the other forms. So I don't know that it's practical or even desirable for an institution to always do co-creative projects. But I think what's important is for an institution, for the team to be honest about what level of power are we ready to give over to our community partners. How can we be honest and transparent about what that relationship will look like? And how perhaps can we keep developing our skills so that more of these types of participation are available to us as we think about the kinds of projects that might be appropriate for the different types.
Handing over control and handing over power to other people, to participants, that is of course a scary thing. So two questions. How do you install trust? You talk about radical trust in your book. Is this something that just happens over time? And if it's a scary thing, handing over control, how do you avoid lying awake at night in the process?
Yeah, what a great question. And this is honestly true for all of us, that it is scary to give up control. What I like to think about is the fact that there's a difference between having power in an environment and using that power to control everything. You don't lose your power and your skills as a curator, as a designer, as an educator or a pedagogue, if you share power and you give others opportunities to be in charge. Your skills will still be valued. And in fact, in every co-creative project I've done, it's always started with community members themselves being scared and saying, we don't know how to make an exhibit. We don't know how to tell our story in a museum space. And you build the trust through that conversation and saying, here are the skills we bring to the table. And here are the gaps. We don't have the knowledge of your lived experience. We don't have the knowledge of your cultural stories that you've been passing down and your heritage. We have skills to put those stories on display beautifully. We have skills to work with you to figure out what themes we want to emphasize in this exhibition and how we might lay it out. Those are supportive roles we can play to you telling your story to the best of your ability. So I guess one piece I'd say is have empathy for the fact that everybody is scared in the situation. And particularly if you're partnering with a community who have felt exploited or excluded from museums in the past, they may have particular fear that their stories are not going to be treated appropriately or that they themselves will not be treated with respect in this partnership. So they are also coming in with fear. But the other thing I would say is this. We don't do participatory projects just because they're interesting or they're fun or they're clever. I think we do these projects to be able to achieve our missions more powerfully. Mm-hmm. So if, for example, you're a museum that has a mission to share the creativity and the artwork of all the people in your community, then you're unable to do that if you can't have relationships with certain communities who don't walk through the door or who perhaps don't even know the museum exists or that it could be a place for them. Certainly when I was a museum director, it was in an institution that really was moving out of step from where the rest of our community was going. And the thing that kept us up at night was the fear that the museum would close or that it would become so irrelevant that only a handful of people in our community would know about it or would find enjoyment and learning there. And so that fear of being irrelevant, of perhaps closing the museum, of all the young people, all the people who weren't of particular race or a particular education or class, all those people who weren't involved, our fear of losing out on engaging them was greater than our fear of losing control in partnering with them to explore new ways of making the museum accessible and valuable and relevant and meaningful.
Is co-creation something that is growing worldwide?
I would say yes. And I would say there are places in the world where it shows up differently. So, for example, in Central and South America, there's a deep tradition of community-rooted museums. And also, more recently, there have been many museums that have been created in partnership with communities after great trauma. In Europe, I've seen it increasingly with the EU emphasis on social inclusion. And obviously, we've also seen at the ICOM level the debate about the very definition of a museum, which perhaps the debate was not about co-creation, but the debate was about public service and about communities and which communities and how are communities involved in museums. I think for many decades, there have been museums around the world moving from being about something to being for someone, as the deceased Stephen Weil used to say. And again, it shows up differently in different parts of the world. So the work I've done with colleagues in museums and libraries and art centers in Europe has really been driven by issues around migration, issues around social inclusion, issues around senses of race identity that are certainly, the Black Lives Matter movement is a global movement, but I think that I've even seen very recently in work in Europe a different conversation about race than maybe I'd seen in the past. I think there's also a lot of conversation in Europe around how this relates to our colonial past and to the collections we have, where those collections came from. And certainly when you think about Belgium or the Netherlands or Spain or Portugal, I think there are a lot of countries where there are more museum professionals getting quite serious about thinking differently about how do we display these objects, whose objects are they, how are we in conversation with the communities who might have different connections with or different stories about these objects or different care practices for these objects than we have had. So yes, I've been seeing this happening around the world and seeing that co-creation is one of the design solutions that can help with these thorny problems of how we think about people who may have been excluded from museums or who may have been objectified or exploited by museums in the past. As well as, frankly, I think this is more true in Europe than it is in the United States. There is a sense that when we have people migrating to our communities, we want to figure out what the way is that we are connecting with, introducing them to, and incorporating their stories into the collective stories of our cities and of our nations. And I think that museums have historically played quite a significant role in that.
Let's say there are people listening in coming from museums, part of museum staff somewhere, and they say, well, in terms of participatory engagement, we're not there yet. What would the first step be that you take?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the institution and what the culture of that institution is. So I would say fundamentally, there's only one thing you need, or maybe two things you need to be able to do participatory work. One is you have to have a genuine interest in what community members might contribute. And two is you have to have like a belief and a respect that what they can contribute could make the museum better. So, I often think about the example of voting in a democratic society. It would be extremely strange if when you went to vote, then they threw away all the votes and they just decided who was going to be elected, somebody in power behind the scenes. And sometimes when museums start to do participatory work before they're ready, it feels like that. It feels like the visitor is being occupied, is being engaged, but ultimately is being ignored. And people are very sensitive to that. So I do think that it takes getting to a point of believing that something more pluralistic, more democratic, more community involved might actually contribute, even if it's messy, even if it's scary, might contribute to something better. Okay. And once you believe that, you can decide to try it in a million different ways. You could decide that first, what we want is just to hear from people what they're interested in. You could decide we have this small hallway that nobody goes down, and maybe there's something we could try there that wouldn't feel so scary. So you can container it early on to a specific part of the institution or a specific night or a specific place or a specific department if that builds your confidence to try more and more. The other thing you can do is just get curious about who's in your community, particularly who's in your community who may not be engaging with your museum. So one of the things we often encourage people to do in the Of By For All program is to go out and to take a walk in a neighborhood where there are a lot of people who live who don't maybe use your museum, and to just look around and be aware, what does the signage look like in the buildings? When you walk into a shop or a restaurant, how do people greet you? What are the smells? What are people wearing? Are people moving quickly? Are they moving slowly? Are there a lot of smiles? What are some of the things that seem to suggest a sense of welcome or inclusion in that neighborhood? And then you can start to ask yourself, are those things present in our museum or are they absent? And if we wanted to be in relationship with this community, what might be some small changes we could do that might mirror more of what we saw created welcoming space in that neighborhood? So you don't necessarily have to start by making changes in your institution. You can start by getting curious about communities, by getting to know people. One of the great things to do, if there's a community who you'd like to engage, is to figure out who are some community leaders, and be able to interview them, not about how they want to work with your museum, but to ask them, what their goals are and what they value and what barriers they feel like they're facing. If you get curious about what matters to them, you're going to do a better job connecting the dots to how that might relate to your mission or your collection or the kinds of programs that you do. I guess I would say that I probably wouldn't start with the mission. In my experience, it often is important to try some things out to start to see some success before you can start to talk about philosophical changes to the whole institution. And so if you're able to do a pilot, or if you're able to say, we're just going to do this for one night or in this one gallery, it may allow you to start building some experience, building some comfort, and also building some arguments for how this could be more and more powerful for your museum.
Referring back to the first part of your answer, do you still often encounter that museums have this more tokenistic way of embracing participation and the whole discourse around participation, and that they do projects, but you feel right away that they don't do it straight from the heart?
I think that in any professional context, if you're doing something that is against the norm or might be laughed at or seen as scary or bad, you are always doing it from the heart, because otherwise, why would you try? So I think that anytime I see a participatory project in a museum, I know that there's somebody who fought for that, who stuck their neck out for it, and who is taking a risk to do that. And I respect that. I think, though, what I hear again and again now is that there are some people who are doing that, but feel like they are constrained because it never moves beyond that one department or that one pilot or that one project. And one question we hear a lot is, we worked with a community on one project, but then that project ended and there was no way for there were no resources for us to keep that relationship with that community. And it felt like we were just dumping them, like we were using them for that project and then we were saying goodbye. And so I do think that the more participatory projects you do, either you run into that frustration, and that's a frustration that I'm hearing from the staff, but you could certainly imagine that frustration is happening in the community as well. And so I think that the more projects you do, the more it puts pressure and encourages you to ask for more. So while I don't necessarily see a lot of tokenistic participation, I do see institutions where they have not allowed themselves to keep building their courage or keep building on the small successes they've had with a participatory project or with a co-created project.
So it's a matter of not expecting quick wins and design a long-term process.
Right. And you can build on it in ways that don't necessarily mean that that it's always bigger or that it's a multi-year plan. So for example, one rule we had when at my museum was, if a community member collaborated or co-created with us, we always wanted to have a next thing to invite them to. So not necessarily saying we're going to do another multi-year exhibition project together, but saying we want to stay in relationship and we're going to be thinking of you and inviting you in multiple ways to be involved. And that is really what shifts you from those one-off community relationships, which are very expensive and disappointing if they just fall off a cliff. I feel like sometimes people get stuck on thinking, well, I need another big project. You don't necessarily need another big project, but you need ways to keep the relationship going, and to keep expanding the different ways that those people or that community might be involved with your institution.
So Nina, you were talking about expressing curiosity. There's always someone, either in the staff, the volunteers of the museum, or in the local communities that expresses some interest to work together, to collaborate in some form. In your experience, where does this interest usually start and who expresses it the first?
I think when it comes to inside a museum, often the curiosity starts in an area of the museum where people are working very directly with audiences. So sometimes this might be an educator, sometimes it might be people who are on the front line. The other place it often comes from is if there's a person on the staff who is themselves part of a marginalized community that is not often seen inside the institution, and they feel like they might want to be an advocate for more people from their community to be able to access the museum. I would also say that sometimes museums think that there are a lot of community members already curious, and that's rarely true. In my experience, a museum has to do a lot of work, a lot of inviting and outreach and curiosity from the staff leaving the building and going into community spaces before community members are going to also be curious. Because again, if you're interested in communities who have not felt that the museum was relevant to them, they're not curious about you. But if an educator, if a staff member goes out to, a mosque, to a volunteer event, to participate in a festival, and is curious and is asking and wanting to learn more about that community, that starts a relationship that might become mutual. So, as an example, we had a staff member at our museum who was very curious about teenagers and where they might fit into this institution. And so we said, okay, great. And one of the things we often encourage in the Of By For All program is that when you get curious, to get quite specific about who you're curious about. So in this case, it wasn't like all teenagers in our city. She, after doing some learning and talking to some art teachers, she said, I think there's this group of what she called creative misfits, who themselves are looking for a place to belong, looking for a place to be creative and be part of our community, and they haven't found that at school. And so we ended up focusing our programs very narrowly on partnering with those teenagers. And actually, as it turned out, another thing that made these teenagers misfits that we weren't aware of when we started was that many of them identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And so that ended up being the group of teenagers who we co-created with closely. Those teenagers ended up really embracing and feeling like the museum was a second home for them after school. And we encouraged them and supported them in hosting their own events in the museum, both events that were created by teens for teens, but also for them to be collaborators and partners in bigger creative festivals and projects that involve people of different ages.
So in general, you could say that museums have a lot of possibilities for co-creations of all different sorts.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that one of the nice things about museums also, if you think about a library and a park over here, and then a theater over here, is museums exist in this space where we do some things all the time, the space that's always open, the core galleries like a library or park. But then we do some things that are project driven, whether that's a special exhibition or a program like a theater. So we kind of have this nice blend of being able to do things that are project specific, like a theater might, but then also being able to do things that are related to the ongoing experience of the space, the way a library or a park might. And so I really think that museums have a lot of opportunity because they occupy both of those kinds of modalities of work.
Okay, so Nina, one final question, and it's more of a researcher's question, I am aware. How do you know that your participatory process, your project or whatever it is, really worked? In other words, can you really measure the outcome of a participatory engagement with the local communities?
I think this is a great question, and I don't think it's just a researcher's question. I think it really is critical if we want more participatory practice to grow in museums. And the thing I would say is, first, if you're just getting started with participation, you almost have to be able to do it without measurement, because anytime we're trying something new, if we are holding it to certain standards or research variables that we might for something we know how to do, it's going to fall short. We don't know yet how to measure it. We don't know yet what's happening. So I would say if you're just starting with participatory work, to start by doing it and observing. What do I think might happen? What do I see is actually happening? You know, we used to joke at our museum when we were starting out that success for us looked like that a partner would call us back when we left them a message. You know, that was just a tiny way of having a sense that we weren't chasing them to get involved, but that they felt they were in relationship with us. As you do more and more of this work, though, there are real meaningful ways to measure. One of those ways fundamentally is attendance. Do you see a shift in who is coming and what they're coming for? And certainly, when I was running the Museum of Art and History, over 8 years, we grew from 17,000 visitors a year to 148,000 visitors a year. And our visitors, who originally were mostly retired white people and school children, became people who represented the full age diversity of our community, the full income diversity of our community, and the racial and ethnic diversity of our community as well. So for us, that was a pretty clear measurable that not only were we having more people come, but that more people from more backgrounds felt welcome there. And so, I think that there's power to using some of the core measurements we've always used. How many people are coming? What awards are we winning? This kind of thing. It is important when we talk about participatory work. And certainly there are museums that have been measured at the highest level based on participatory work. I think about the Stedelijk Museum Schiedam in the Netherlands, a very small museum that won the National Museum Award because of the incredible participatory work they were doing with communities. So I think you can use some of your traditional measures, but you can also use new measures. We had a series of statements about, I felt creatively empowered here. I felt like I built connections that will be useful in my career or in my life here. So thinking about what is the museum to you? Is it empowering you? Is it creating more social connections? Is it becoming a place that you see as critical to your experience in the community? And so we saw that in terms of measurables, in terms of more donations, more involvement. And we talked earlier about this idea of who gets curious. I remember one key thing we were able to very clearly see was for the first couple of years, we were constantly saying, bring us your ideas. We were constantly reaching out to communities and saying, we'd like to work with you on X. We're curious about Y, da, 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 da. And after a couple of years of working that way, it started to flip. And community members started walking in the door and saying, I've never been here, but I've heard this is a place where I could do X. Or somebody who ran an organization would call me and would say, I saw what you did in partnership with foster youth. Do you think we could do that with socially isolated senior citizens? So what another measurable is the community starting to come to you with opportunities for partnership, for collaboration. And ultimately, if you are doing all of this participatory work, I hope you're doing it for a reason. I hope you do have a goal. And actually, in the Of By For All program, the very first thing we ask organizational teams to do is to write a vision to say, in 5 to 10 years, if we could do everything we dream of in being in closer connection with our community, what would it look like? And we challenge people actually to write a day in the life, walk into a museum in 2030. After you've done all of these changes, what's different? Who's there? What do you see happening? Who has power? Who's talking? All those kinds of things. What's on the wall? And while a vision may, from a research perspective, every vision is going to be different and idiosyncratic. If you have a vision of what you're trying to create, you are much more likely to go there. So yes, experimentation is good, but don't be afraid to dream big about how you want your institution to be better, how you want your institution to be different, and then to look for those opportunities, to be curious, to build relationships so that you can build that better museum together.
Indeed, let's try to dream big, and I'm sure the attendance of this conference will try to do so in the upcoming years. And thank you for joining us and for sharing your ideas. It was very interesting and very instructive.
Thank you so much. And yes, I hope to, my greatest wish is to see people all over the world doing this work boldly with your communities and in very different ways, perhaps, than I have done or than others have done before. So I can't wait to see what you and your community co-create together.